Thank you, Anne-Marie, for the kind words. It's a real privilege to be part of this conversation, coming from the outside. As a German-speaking Swiss, I will try to speak in the not so precise language of English. Hope you can understand me. I really love this emphasis on bringing theological education and church together. I've always been a church person, and theological education has always been important for me to be instrumental to educate people for the church and for the kingdom of God. I'm also here as a learner. From my experience with EEAA and accreditation, traveling across Europe from Scandinavia to the Middle East, visiting schools in Egypt and Sweden, and from the Ukraine, from Kiev to Portugal, I always came as a learner, and in each context I learned a lot. And I know after the 2 days here I will enriched, I will go back. You asked me particularly for this introductory speech to say something on developments and challenges in evangelical theological education in Europe. Given the diversity and the complexity of Europe and of the evangelical community in Europe, it should be self-evident that you cannot expect a comprehensive and well-balanced picture of the situation. In addition, my perspective and my insights are limited. Please understand this as a hopefully inspiring invitation for further reflections during this conference. I'm interested in hearing your perspectives and your experiences as well. My understanding is that the trends, challenges, and needs of evangelical theological education are caused by larger developments in Europe and the ways we respond to these developments. And in particular, I think of three contexts, and I will address these three contexts. The so-called Bologna process and the way it affects theological education in Europe. And secondly, the changing face of Christianity in Europe and how this challenges traditional theological education. And thirdly, a pedagogical shift that is taking place and what it means for theological education. As I approach this topic, I also want to say I owe a lot to my friends of the EEA Council and all the conversations we have there. And of course the larger community of the EEA and the many visits and conversations I had in many schools. And also my colleagues at the European School of Culture and Theology at Cornell, the students there, and the many conversations. In particular, I have to refer to several doctoral students. They have done research in the area of theological education in Europe, and I have learned a lot from their research. So I start with the first context, Bologna and the way it affects theological education. The reshaping of the European higher education area associated with the term Bologna process has now been underway for almost 20 years. Some speak of the greatest revolution in higher education since the emergence of the modern university 200 years ago. The Catholic scholar Klaus Müller speaks of the greatest reform of study since Humboldt, who was the leader of the Berlin University at the beginning of the modern university. With regard to the discipline of theology, this means that the Bologna process has initiated the most serious reconstruction of theological education since Schleiermacher, who was the inventor of the curriculum as we still use it today. What are the opportunities and the challenges of these developments for evangelical theological education in Europe? Let me start with opportunities. First of all, the Bologna process has opened amazing possibilities for private institutions of higher learning to get formal government recognition through national accrediting agencies. In most countries, this was not possible prior to the Bologna process, with a few exceptions. Scandinavian countries, or in the UK, it was a bit earlier. However, in the last 20 years, many evangelical theological colleges and seminaries have achieved state accreditation. In Germany and Switzerland, the German-speaking part I know best, about 10 evangelical schools have reached state accreditation. What are the consequences and the implications? I see three. First of all, from the students' perspective, students now receive state-accredited, publicly recognized academic degrees. Their diplomas are no longer just a certification of quality valued within the evangelical Christian community, and this opens doors for further studies at universities and enhances employability beyond the church-related sector. Of course, also for the churches and the Christian organizations, this has new perspectives. It means that their theologians have a greater public recognition. It adds value to the public appearance of the church and the Christian organizations. And finally, for the institutions themselves. Theological schools going through accreditation processes are forced to become learning organizations. Institutional processes have to shift from maintenance orientation to enterprise orientation. And this has significant potential for the development of institutions into the future. It's fundamental for viability and sustainability. However, I also observe significant challenges. One I would call academization. In the process of accreditation, the academic level has to be raised. This refers to entrance qualifications for students, faculty qualifications, as well as students' output, what students produce. This, I think, is a mixed blessing. On the one hand, it is desirable that the evangelical community has theologians who are qualified to engage in academia. The church benefits from sound and solid academic theology. It is even part of the church's mission to engage in all areas of life, including the world of the university. However, the process of academization has intensified the tension between personal faith and academic work. It seems to be an unavoidable challenge of rational and academic theology. The integration of spirituality and rationality is one of the biggest, in my view, unsolved issues in academic theological education. I do not have to summarize the entire discussion of the last 20, 30, 40 years on this issue. More academically qualified students who otherwise would have opted for theological studies in one of the state universities may now attend the evangelical institutions, and this is a significant change. On the other hand, accredited institutions may lose those to whom access to not accredited school colleges was possible. If the student body represents the future of ministerial leadership in the churches, this means a shift in the qualification of this leadership. We will have possibly more academics in church leadership roles and possibly lose some people, gifted people, who do not have the qualification to go for these academic studies. This is a significant shift, and in my view, it's not a healthy development. Another issue is institutionalization. The accreditation process within the framework of national accreditation procedures requires substantial administrative institutional development. I cannot go into the details here, but anyone who went through this process is familiar with these realities. Besides all the potential benefits for the institution, it cannot be overlooked that it binds resources, sometimes in a disproportionate measure. It can lead to the situation that those in academic leadership and administration are preoccupied with quality assessment, data processing, documentation, reporting according to the requirements of accreditation. And we know from research that some leaders in universities and higher education institutions tell us that they do not have sufficient time to think about the foundational and basic issues of purpose of theological education, because administration just eats up the time and the energy. The third one is educational philosophy. Bologna also stands for a shift in educational philosophy. Some of the slogans are fitness for purpose, or competence orientation, or output orientation, or in less polite terms, some people speak of the McDonaldization of higher education, or I've even read the term the Bolognianization of theological education. Such slogans are expressions of critical reflections on the market-driven agenda of the entire Bologna process. Employability, economic usability are some of the key concepts that reflect the pragmatic, sometimes even utilitarian tendencies in the Bologna enterprise. Again, this is not the place to go into the critical discussion of all these issues, but it has consequences for theological education. I think we have not yet done our homework thinking critically about this entire process. Maybe we are sometimes blinded by the potential benefits without looking at the challenges, and we have to address the challenges. This leads me to the second main context I would like to address. So the first one is the educational development, university development. The second one is the changing face of Christianity in Europe and how this challenges traditional theological education. It is not a secret that Christianity in Europe is undergoing dramatic changes. Quite often post-terminology is used to name the paradigmatic shifts we are experiencing. Post-Christendom, post-modern, post-traditional, post-denominational, or even post-evangelical. However, no single concept can capture the complex developments we are observing. I pick out only three aspects which, in my view, challenge traditional theological education. One I would call post-traditional Christian movements. The landscape of the church in Europe is drastically changing. Traditional denominations are in most countries not the growing segment of the Christian movement. If there is growth at all, it comes through new, emerging, missional, alternative, and other forms of Christianity. The critical question is, does theological education in its traditional forms reach the leadership of these new movements? In fact, we observe already something like an emerging movement of alternative structures for ministerial training, and I suspect that such new models will attract more young people who are socialized in post-traditional circles. They will not go to the traditional theological schools. What are the contours of these fresh expressions of theological education? In a global context, Kevin Higgins mentioned 4 dimensions, and I see them also in European context, and I just mentioned those quickly. One has to do with the delivery, the mood of delivery. Leaders of such new movements prefer decentralized, flexible, modular, and customized solutions for their training. Most traditional theological colleges and seminaries are not, or not yet, offering sufficiently attractive programs. Second one has to do with content. For example, research in the eastern part of Germany showed, one of my doctoral students did such a study, that graduates from traditional seminaries are not well prepared to found and lead emerging church movements in the urban, secularized terrain of that region. So the question is, how do we need to train those type of church leaders and church planters? The focus of traditional theological education is very often on the preparation of pastors for established churches. The curriculum is designed for the traditional pastoral roles. It's more maintenance than mission-oriented. It does not prepare leaders to navigate off the map. Traditional evangelical theological education is strong in teaching the right theology, but it often does not train students how to theologize on new terrain. The third issue is that the recipients. The group of people identified as leaders of emerging movements operates often outside the defined and regulated framework of classical pastoral roles, formal theological degree requirements, or ordination. Some of them can, for various reasons, not reach the requirement for ordination in classical denominations, and many just don't care about classical theological education and qualification for ordination. However, many young people are eager to get the training that enables them to minister off the map on new territory. And because traditional seminaries and colleges do not adequately serve this growing community, new forms of ministerial training emerge, often completely below the radar of existing networks of theological institutions and accreditation. And this finally leads to certification. In many cases, new educational initiatives and emerging movements care less about academic accreditation. Traditional accreditation is committed to meeting the standards of higher education. Alternatives form of certification care more about locating the certification process itself within the church. The slogan "from graduating seminary students to commissioning kingdom leaders" has been used. Not all these fresh expressions of theological education may be able to really deliver what they promise. And those engaged in traditional theological education may look critically at these new initiatives. However, their emergence is an indicator of a growing segment of ministerial training that seems to be closer to the future of the Christian movement in Europe than some of the traditional theological colleges and seminaries. And I think this is one of the challenges for traditional theological education. A second major issue in terms of the development of Christianity in Europe is migration. Not much needs to be said about the impact of migration on society at large in most European countries, and the church in particular in many places. There are challenging issues on the table. How will migrant Christians relate to the Christians in Europe and vice versa? Will it be possible to integrate migrant Christians in existing European churches? How will the European churches serve those migrants who are not Christians? And above all, how will it be possible to train leaders in a holistic way for the migrant churches? How do traditional evangelical schools respond to the needs and challenges of the migrant church? I see encouraging examples of evangelical theological colleges that manage to connect with the migrant community and to implement educational programs for migrant church leaders. But the number of successful attempts I see is low. The need is undisputable, but I see at least 3 significant challenges. The first one is the institutionalized forms of traditional theological education. Standard curricula, duration, accreditation costs do not serve well the needs and possibilities of most migrant Christians. Another one is the clash of Western traditional, well-reflected and sober Christian spirituality with the sometimes enthusiastic, expressive and experience-oriented faith of some non-Western cultures complicates encounter and community and collaboration and mutual understanding. And finally, Western pedagogy characterized by student-teacher equality, by critical thinking, by direct communication, by controversial debate, individualism and rational argumentation is often foreign to students coming from other cultures and creates serious challenges for Western teachers and for non-Western students. For the existing evangelical theological institutions in Europe, I think it's a must to engage more decisively with the community of the migrant Christians, addressing their needs for ministerial training. And the third issue, individualization, diversity, fragmentation. Traditional models of theological education were based on a number of realities. Cohorts of students, quite coherent age group, mostly full-time students, often residential, same curriculum for all students, only minimal variations, maybe a few electives, and therefore coherent and integrated curriculum with more or less the same group together throughout the process of studies. These realities belong to the past in most contexts. They are no longer norm biographies. Every student is an individual case with his or her own history, his or her specific needs and interests, experiencing his or her particular phase in life, looking for a tailor-made course of studies. Of course, this is perhaps somewhat overstated, but it reflects a trend, at least in some parts of Europe. If theological schools want to survive in the market, they have to adjust. The results are diversification of program profiles, modularization, flexibility in the formats of delivery, and as much freedom as possible for students to design their studies individually according to their life situation. I'm not saying this is all good, I'm describing a reality. These developments are supported by decentralized formats of delivery, many forms of distance learning, and of course internet-based education. Opportunities and challenges are enormous. Diversified theological education is a term often used in this context. And it's not just a necessary response to diversity we reluctantly accept. It's an opportunity to equip all God's people for ministry, and not just an academic elite that can afford centralized and full-time studies. Such diversification of theological education should be driven by ecclesial and missional conviction, not just because we are forced to do it. However, as many of us know, the realization of diversified model of flexible theological education is challenging in many ways. I just mentioned a few of the challenges, and many of you are familiar with this. How many program profiles can we run parallel and still have a sufficient number of students in each program? The same is true at the course level. How many courses can we offer and still have sufficient number of students in each course? How flexible can the curriculum be and still have some kind of integrative center? How do we handle curricular progression and flexible formats of delivery? How do we manage the pedagogical transition required to move from classical full-time residential teaching and learning to flexible model of distance learning delivery? How do we train our faculty to handle these new formats of delivery? Some of the most innovative and successful institutions work mainly without campus facilities, decentralized in rented buildings or online. How do we create an ethos and the culture of an educational institution in this format of training? Such schools also often work predominantly with adjunct faculty. How do we train these teachers to handle the flexible and diverse formats of pedagogically, including internet-based education? How do you create identity and coherence in such programs? Students studying model and flexible often need long period of time to complete a degree. How do we keep programs stable and sustainable so that students even can complete the program because it's still in existence in 5 years, and 7 years, 10 years? Do we have the resources to develop, offer, and sustain a variety of customized programs? Can we afford accreditation for several programs? How can we handle diversification administratively? It becomes quite complex. What do we promise students in terms of employability and access for further studies if we offer specialized program profiles, and so on? And these are all things I have experienced in the institution I've been working and as I visit schools. These observations already point to another paradigmatic shift, and this is my third one. The third context is a pedagogical paradigm shift and what it means for theological education. Third context that influences, challenges theological education is the pedagogical paradigm shift, often characterized by a series of slogans, and I just have a list here. From teaching to learning, from teaching objectives to learning objectives, from teacher-centeredness to student-centeredness, from content to competences, from distancing to involvement, from studies in educational institutions to in-ministry training, from studying to learning by doing, from declarative knowledge to functioning knowledge, from input to output, from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side, and so on. Each slogan can be a topic for an entire evening. They all are expressions of a very big shift in education and in epistemology. And I only mention three major themes: the development of adult education, the development of constructivist pedagogies, and the so-called empirical turn and the new emphasis on praxis. Again, this is not the point at the time to enter into a foundational discussion on all these concepts. I only want to develop one aspect. Traditionally, evangelical theological education emphasized what sometimes is called declarative knowledge. Declarative knowledge is the knowledge in books and in the library and stored in the history and the past to formulated theology. The aforementioned pedagogical shift, however, demands a greater emphasis on so-called functioning knowledge, applied knowledge, knowledge for the praxis. In the context of theological education, this means that our practice of teaching theology as declarative knowledge needs to be supplemented by learning to theologize. Not just teach theology, but learning to theologize. I'm convinced that this development has great potential for theological education without becoming a sellout to relativism, constructivism, or functionalism. In other words, if we want to respond constructively to the needs and challenges caused by context 1 and 2, we need to talk about changes in pedagogy. And I again mentioned three areas. Curriculum and context. Traditionally, the theological curriculum was derived deductively from the Christian tradition, and it was formalized as a canon of foundational knowledge. So you have all the classical topics you have to talk about. Consequently, the curriculum comprises a list of courses in which the established content is transmitted from the teacher or the textbook to the student. The assumption was, or is, that the student would make it from the assimilation of knowledge to the ministerial or professional practice. Sometimes this transfer into practice is supported by theoretical reflection about the practice or by discussing applications, but in many cases students are left on their own. In any case, the flow, the direction of thinking moves from declarative knowledge, from theory to application. The aforementioned shift in educational philosophy includes a fresh understanding of curriculum. In accordance with the original meaning of the term, curriculum is a journey of learning, and point of departure of the journey is life and realities and experience, practice, context, situation. Intended learning outcomes are derived inductively from the context of life and ministry. In view of these intended learning outcomes, the supporting declarative knowledge and the required learning activity have to be defined. Already 20 years ago, Andrew Kirk suggested a reform of curricula design based on this so-called See, Judge, Act cycle, sometimes also called the pastoral circle. You start with observation in reality and practice, then you go to the Bible. Students expect to be seen by professors as equals. They want to meet at eye level. Students don't want to be seen as empty vessels to be filled with the knowledge the teacher possesses. Students want to bring their experience and their expertise to the learning process. Students expect teachers to listen to their questions, experiences, and insights. Teachers have to become learners. However, students expect teachers to do more than just moderate classroom interaction. Teachers are supposed to bring their expertise into the process in order to advance the learning of the students. Student expects the content to be relevant for life, ministry, and profession. Students are interested in the production of output, learning activities, assessment tasks, that is meaningful in view of the intended outcome for ministry and mission. Students expect teachers not just to present knowledge, but to represent knowledge, or even more, wisdom, to embody what they teach. And students grow if I-thou relationships are established. At the end of the day, it's all about transformative learning. Do curricula provide a journey of learning that helps that students will be transformed as persons for their ministry, for their life? My observation, my assessment is that we see encouraging developments in many institutions, sometimes at the level of individual faculty who capture the relevance of these shifts and changes in pedagogy. Less often I observe it at the institutional level. The change of the entire culture of an institution seems to be challenging, and many institutions still have a long way to go. I'm convinced that faculty development stands at the heart of such developments. And this leads me to a final point. Faculty facilitators of learning. The phrase "the faculty is the curriculum" has been around for many years. It may not be the entire, but certainly an important truth. What does this mean in connection with my emphasis on educational shifts? The educational philosophy of an institution needs to be embodied by the faculty. Otherwise, it remains theory, written down in mission statements and manuals. This directs our focus to faculty training and faculty development. How can faculty facilitate the transformative learning introduced earlier? This was the topic of one of my doctoral students, Deborah Kramlich, who did research among EEA schools in Europe on the role of teachers in facilitating transformative learning. And it's very interesting results. That there is one side, that the quality of a teacher comprises two dimensions. The teacher as a person, so his or her presence as a person in relation to the students, and the teacher in practice with his pedagogical, didactical practice. The research shows that students and faculty rate performance of teacher as person higher than performance of teacher in practice. So this means that the person in relationship seems to be the better part or the easier part than the pedagogical or didactic qualification. This has many consequences. If we move from formats of delivery which have high degree of faculty presence to formats that disconnect the student from the person of the teacher, remove the stronger part of the teacher's role and leave him with the weaker part. If you take this into consideration, we have to talk about faculty development in the area of pedagogy didactic. The research confirmed existing studies by showing that the environment, the culture, the school culture, even the national culture, has a tremendous impact on transformative learning. This makes us think about the culture of a school. What kind of culture do we shape in our schools? Revealing was also the expressed needs by faculty for further training. So faculty asked what they would like to learn. The 5 top topics mentioned by about 400 teachers in EEA schools. Number 1, course and instructional design. Activities to do during classes. Art of asking good questions. Structuring class time according to brain research. Organizing group discussion time. So these are very practical pedagogical questions, and faculty are asking for training in these areas. Traditionally, it has been assumed in higher education that a person who has earned a degree in his or her particular discipline is automatically qualified to teach. This has been changing in recent years, and it's also one of the helpful contributions of the Bologna process that university professors are required to receive formal training in higher education pedagogy. As evangelical institutions, we should not stay behind, assuming that good theologians are automatically good teachers. Research, not only the aforementioned dissertation, gives us a clear message. There is a verifiable correlation between the pedagogical training of faculty and the quality of transformative learning. If this is true, faculty training needs to be on our agenda. And I attest that it is on the agenda of EEAA, because this is one of the keys for the transformation, not only of theological education, but of people in the process of their studies. So these are the 3 main areas I see and some of the consequences I draw from it. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to the contribution from your side.